Hello, everyone. In a world drowning in slogans, propaganda, and wishful thinking, the war in Ukraine has become the defining test of power in the 21st century. For nearly 3 years, Western leaders promised a swift Russian defeat, sanctions would collapse, Moscow, NATO weapons would decide the battlefield, and Ukraine would march triumphantly to its 1,991 borders. None of that has happened. In fact, the opposite is true. Russia is advancing, Ukraine is bleeding out, and the entire Western strategy is collapsing under the weight of its own illusions. Today, we cut through the noise. No politics, no media fiction, just the hard reality of war, power, and consequences, and a clear look at how Russia has already reshaped the future of Europe, whether Washington is ready to admit it or not. The current state of the Ukraine conflict and the broader international situation reveals above all the incoherence and impotence of US foreign policy and the relative strategic confidence of Russia, which understands that it has effectively won the war on the ground and can afford to treat Western diplomatic maneuvers as background noise rather than decisive factors. Washington has circulated a so-called 28-point peace plan, then a 19-point, then a 22-point version, which already illustrates how disorganized the process is, and Russian officials such as Ryabkov have made clear that Moscow is not interested in playing along with these dirty games, because Russia has already made enough concessions and holds the leverage in Ukraine, where it is advancing and shaping facts on the ground, while the United States cannot even align its own government, much less the Kyiv regime or the Europeans, behind a coherent settlement. The reality is that Russia views the conflict as fundamentally between itself and the United States, with Kyiv as a proxy, and sees the main obstacle not in any detailed wording of the plan, but in the utter lack of unity and reliability in the collective West. Trump may occasionally recognize that his leverage over Russia is effectively zero. His own remark that Russia's only concession is not taking more Ukrainian territory says as much, but the U.S. administration, packed with bipartisan neoconservatives who still cling to primacy and hegemony as dogma, has no consistent strategy, and Trump himself behaves less like a statesman than a transactional real estate boss whose positions shift according to whoever last whispered in his ear. Within this fractured context, Kremlin officials see Washington's internal divisions, the deep state, Congress, the permanent bureaucracy, the media, and the military-industrial complex all pulling in different directions, making it diplomatically impossible for the United States to commit credibly to any agreement. The Russians have watched the U.S. withdraw from or undermine major treaties from the ABM Treaty to INF, Open Skies, JCPOA, and Minsk, and conclude that serious diplomacy with such a partner must rely on formal, legally robust structures and international mechanisms, not on handshakes and smoke-filled rooms or ad hoc talking points drafted on the back of a napkin by amateurs like Kushner and his associates. From Moscow's point of view, the Trump peace plan is not a draft agreement, but a set of talking points, an ultimatum dressed up as diplomacy, combining a ceasefire on current lines with vague promises about future arrangements, attempts to control or steal frozen Russian assets, and conditions that Kyiv openly rejects. No territorial concessions, no binding neutrality, no real demilitarization, no limits on NATO ties, and certainly no denazification. Unsurprisingly, the Kyiv regime initially strutted around claiming it had killed Trump's plan and imposed its own version, insisting on a ceasefire without concessions and refusing any restrictions on NATO membership or force structure. The United States, in turn, tried to reassert leverage by weaponizing the very anti-corruption bodies it once helped create, NABU and SAPO, allowing long-prepared investigations to move from flashing yellow to full green light against Zelensky's inner circle. This is how the powerful chief of staff Yermak, once described as the true power behind the throne, and Zelensky's gray cardinal, found himself targeted, with investigators raiding his home and his resignation engineered under obvious U.S. pressure after he had publicly boasted that Trump's initiative was dead, a classic example of Washington using lawfare against its own proxies to discipline them, while the Europeans looked on in horror at yet another wave of destabilization in Kyiv in the middle of military and economic collapse. Yet all this palace intrigue in Kyiv, the downfall of Yermak, the maneuvering of oligarchs like Kolomoisky, the ambitions of Poroshenko, Klitschko, the potential rise of figures like Budanov, and the attempt by some factions to shield themselves from prosecution by exploiting mobilization laws that suspend investigations for those in uniform does not alter the fundamental strategic landscape. The regime is losing on the battlefield. Ukraine's economy is on life support. The Europeans cannot fund Kyiv indefinitely without resorting to outright theft of Russian assets, and even that would, at best, buy another year or so, while alienating the global South and confirming Russia's narrative that Western rule-based order is a mask for legalized robbery. For Russia, the process is increasingly clear. It participates in diplomatic theater, primarily to maintain its image with the BRICS and the wider global South as the responsible, rational actor that is open to negotiations, while quietly making sure that the real outcome is decided by military means. Moscow knows that any Western-sponsored settlement that leaves a hostile, Nazi-influenced regime in Kiev preserves NATO's reach into Ukraine and grants amnesty to war criminals would not satisfy Russia's declared aims of demilitarization and denazification, nor would it be politically acceptable to a Russian public that has seen years of shelling in Donbass, pedal mines in Donetsk, and now terrorist tactics like rigged banknotes and small objects exploding in Moscow and maiming children. This is why many in the Kremlin actually prefer to avoid an early diplomatic compromise. It would simply freeze a problem that must be resolved structurally, and it would be impossible to explain to Russian society why people who have blown off the hands of Russian children or carried out terrorist attacks should be allowed to remain in power under some amnesty, which is why voices inside Russia increasingly insist that true denazification and debanderization require regime change in Kyiv and the restoration of historically Russian territories such as Odessa. Politically and morally, anything less would be seen as an incomplete and unsatisfactory conclusion to the special military operation. At the same time, Russia is consolidating its military advantages. Its conventional forces are expanding in size and combat experience. Its defense industry is producing more missiles and equipment than the conflict itself consumes, leading to stockpiles. While NATO is running dry of key air defense interceptors and munitions, and its innovation in drone warfare is reshaping the battlefield with systems like Terran, loitering, munitions, Lancet strike drones, and airdropped Fab glide bombs upgraded with extended-range kits and jet engines. We now see new variants like the Duran 3 Black reportedly able to hunt Ukrainian aircraft and helicopters, turning the tables on a Kyiv air defense posture that had relied on Western fighters primarily as drone hunters. On the ground, the war has evolved into a dense, technologically saturated environment where both sides use FPV drones and countermeasures such as road-spanning netting to protect logistics routes. And Russia is now countering even these nets by deploying drones equipped with thermite or incendiary payloads that burn entire stretches of overhead cover, a surreal but telling image of how thoroughly the character of warfare has shifted toward remote, cheap, high-volume systems that NATO militaries are neither doctrinally nor industrially prepared to match in a peer conflict against Russia on its doorstep. In parallel, Ukraine has escalated in the maritime and energy domains by attacking oil tankers in the Black Sea and energy infrastructure like the Caspian Pipeline Consortium facilities near Novorossiysk targets that often involve Kazakh resources and Western energy interests rather than purely Russian assets, raising the possibility that some of these operations may also serve as indirect messages to Washington as internal frictions grow between the U.S. and its own proxy, especially after Yermak's fall. These attacks risk widening the war into open conflict against commercial shipping, driving up insurance and forcing costly rerouting. But Russia can adapt by shifting flows toward the Pacific and non-Black Sea routes, whereas the political cost for the West and global markets may be substantial. Europe, meanwhile, has committed what can only be described as economic and geopolitical suicide by sacrificing cheap Russian energy and entangling itself in a war it cannot win and cannot fund. The EU has accelerated deindustrialization, pushed major companies to relocate to the United States, and exposed the hollowness of its claim to be an independent great power. In Germany, France, and the UK, political elites still talk about confronting Russia, restarting conscription, and making generational sacrifices, yet their militaries are in disarray, their industrial bases cannot sustain long-term high-intensity warfare, and any genuinely anti-system parties that question the Atlanticist line are marginalized or threatened with bans rather than treated as legitimate partners in coalition politics, proving that the much-touted European democracy will be abandoned the moment it challenges NATO's warline. Beyond Ukraine, the same pattern of incoherence and overreach can be observed in U.S. behavior in the Middle East, Latin America, and Africa. Washington simultaneously greenlights Israeli escalation across Gaza, Syria, and Lebanon, while facing a critical shortage of air defense interceptors, flirts with confrontation against Iran despite the obvious risk of strategic retaliation, and piles pressure on Venezuela while sending a large naval presence that it does not seem to know how to use, oscillating between talk of regime change, drug interdiction, and symbolic shows of force, but hesitating to cross thresholds that would trigger massive blowback in oil prices and domestic U.S. politics. The Syrian case, where an entire national army was largely neutralized through intelligence penetration, co-optation, and sudden collapse in the face of jihadist offensives, illustrates the kind of covert approach Washington might dream of repeating in Venezuela or elsewhere. Yet the world has changed. Russia and Iran have learned from Syria. The global South is more wary. And even within the U.S., war weariness and internal division make large-scale adventures harder to sustain, even if elements of the deep state still push relentlessly for destabilization operations. In East Asia, the U.S. posture toward China and Taiwan is equally contradictory. Washington fuels tensions and encourages provocative rhetoric from dependent allies like the current Japanese leadership, then tries to dial things back when Chinese leverage in trade, rare earths, and finance becomes unavoidable, revealing once again that there is no long-term strategy, only reactive moves driven by ideology, domestic lobbies, and short-term political calculations. All of this leads to a single strategic conclusion. The United States is suffering from hegemonic overstretch and is diplomatically incapable, unable to align its own institutions behind a coherent foreign policy while still clinging to the illusion of primacy. This makes it unpredictable and dangerous, but not necessarily effective. And increasingly, other powers, Russia, China, Iran, major actors in the global South, treat it as a chaotic factor to be contained, worked around, or used against itself as it gets bogged down in multiple theaters. Russia, in contrast, is operating from a position of growing confidence. It has weathered the economic war, is winning on the battlefield, has secured substantial support, or at least neutrality, from most of the non-Western world, and is in no hurry to grant the West a diplomatic exit that would allow it to pretend that this was a stalemate rather than a defeat. Instead, Moscow can continue to grind down Ukrainian capabilities, expand control over key territories, and wait for the inevitable moment of recognition in which Western elites will be forced, however reluctantly, to acknowledge that their attempt to defeat and isolate Russia has failed, that the costs of continued escalation are unsustainable, and that a new multipolar security architecture with Russia as a central pillar is emerging from the ruins of their own failed strategy. Russia's strategy in Ukraine has now moved beyond the initial objectives of protecting Russian-speaking populations and securing Crimea and Donbass. It has evolved into a structural reconfiguration of the regional security architecture, one that permanently eliminates Ukraine as a NATO bridgehead and restores what Moscow views as historical equilibrium in Eastern Europe. Russia's armed forces have adapted faster than any Western planner expected, transforming lessons from the battlefield into rapid doctrinal innovation. Electronic warfare dominance neutralizes vast numbers of Western-supplied drones. Integrated reconnaissance networks merge satellite feeds with frontline operators. And industrial mobilization has shifted Russia into a wartime economy that produces artillery shells, missiles, armored vehicles, and UAVs at multiples of the combined NATO output directed toward Ukraine. Meanwhile, the constant infusion of Western weaponry into Kyiv has only slowed, not reversed, strategic trends. Patriot and NASAMS systems are being attrited faster than they can be replaced. Abrams and Leopards are withdrawn from front lines because they burn under Lancets, and F-16 seconds are forced to operate like frightened birds taking off from distant Western airfields only to hunt slow drones while avoiding the long reach of Russian air defenses. Ukraine is trapped in a paradox. Every new game changer the West ships merely becomes further proof that Russia can defeat Western technology with cheaper, more numerous, and rapidly evolving indigenous systems. This is not simply a fight between two armies. It is a demonstration that Russia's military-industrial base has outlasted and outperformed a coalition that vastly underestimated Moscow's resilience, capacity, and strategic patience. Diplomatically, Russia holds the initiative because it is the only actor pursuing in-state objectives grounded in reality. The establishment of a neutral, demilitarized, denazified Ukraine under long-term Russian security oversight, recognition of territorial changes not as temporary gains, but as irreversible corrections of post-2014 Western interference, and a settlement that ensures NATO can never again use Ukraine as a springboard for pressure along Russia's core borders. This clarity stands in stark contrast to a Kyiv leadership whose definition of victory remains a fantasy, restoration of 1,991 borders while its territory shrinks, its best brigades are destroyed, and its political center collapses into corruption, scandals, purges, and infighting. For Moscow, time is not a threat but an ally. Every month that passes accelerates the exhaustion of Ukraine's manpower pool, deepens Europe's economic crisis, and exposes the widening fracture between American rhetoric and American capability. The Kremlin understands that negotiations today would only freeze a conflict. Russia is actively winning. Thus, Moscow has no incentive to slow down until it has secured Odessa, eliminated the Ukrainian coastline as a Western asset, expanded the buffer around Donbass to tactically manageable lines, and ensured that no future Ukrainian state, whatever its form, can wield militarized anti-Russian nationalism as a geopolitical weapon. The West's strategic gamble was that Russia would collapse under sanctions and battlefield losses before Kyiv faltered. Instead, Russia has grown stronger in every dimension that matters: military, industrial, diplomatic, while Ukraine approaches the breaking point where battlefield defeat and political implosion converge. In this reality, the only true negotiation that remains is not over borders or peace terms, but over the timeline and manner in which Western actors will finally admit what has already been decided by force. Russia has won the war for Ukraine's future.